The howl broke through the night like a blade through silk, and every wolf in the Ironclaw camp froze where they stood. It was not a howl of warning. It was not a howl of celebration after a hunt. It was the sound of something breaking, low and long, coming from the healer's tent at the edge of camp, and Cale Ashwood was already running, before his mind caught up with his feet. He pushed through the flap of the tent, and stopped cold. Fenrir lay on his side in the straw, his massive body trembling, his back leg wrapped in bloodied cloth that had soaked through twice already that day. The great gray wolf, who had once run beside chariots, and torn through enemy lines without slowing, was now struggling just to lift his head. His amber eyes found Cale's face, and for one terrible moment, Cale saw something in them he had never seen before. Surrender. No, Cale said, dropping to his knees beside the wolf. His voice cracked, though he would never have allowed it to crack in front of his warriors. Here, in this tent, with no one but the healer and his dying companion, he allowed himself one moment of raw fear. No, you do not get to give up, not you, not after everything. The healer, an old woman named Ilsa, who had patched together more wolves and warriors than she could count, placed a weathered hand on Cale's shoulder. His body is healing, my king. The wound is closing, but his spirit, she said, shaking her head slowly, his spirit is somewhere I cannot reach. 3 months had passed since the battle at Thornridge, where the Vale Legion had ambushed the Ironclaw scouting party in the narrow pass between the mountains. Fenrir had thrown himself between Cale and a falling boulder meant to crush them both, and the stone had shattered the bones in his hind leg, beyond anything Ilsa had seen survive. That he lived at all was called a miracle by the pack. That he had stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped even trying, was called something else. Something the pack did not like to say out loud. Cale leaned close to the wolf's ear. Fenrir had been his brother's companion first, bonded to Corin Ashwood since they were both pups, running through the training fields together, before either of them understood what war would one day ask of them. When Corin fell defending the eastern border 2 winters ago, it was Fenrir who carried his body home across 3 days of hard country without resting, without eating, without making a single sound. And it was Fenrir who, in the months after, had chosen to bond himself to Cale, instead of returning to the wild, as if he understood that the pack could not survive losing both brothers at once. Fenrir was not just a werewolf, he was the last living piece of Corin that Cale had left. Please, Cale whispered, so quietly that even Ilsa did not hear it. Please don't leave me too. The wolf's tail did not move. His breathing slowed until it was barely a whisper of air passing through his nose. Cale stayed beside him through the night and through the next, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing the counsel of his advisors who told him a king could not afford to grieve over an animal, while the Vale Legion still tested the borders. He did not care what a king could afford. He cared about the wolf who had saved his life and was now dying an inch at a time, and there was nothing in Cale's considerable strength, his sharpened blade, or his crown that could stop it. On the 4th night, a scout burst into the war tent where Cale sat staring at maps he was not reading, and announced that the seasonal supply caravan had arrived early from the southern villages, carrying grain, cloth, and medicine ahead of the coming storms. Cale barely lifted his eyes. Supplies did not matter to him now. Nothing mattered, except the wolf slowly fading in the healer's tent. He would be wrong about that within the hour. Among the traders unloading carts in the torchlight was a young Omega, no one in the pack recognized, moving quietly between the wagons, with a basket of dried herbs balanced against his hip. He was smaller than most of the warriors, with soft brown hair that fell loose around his face and eyes, the color of riverstone, calm and steady, in a way that made the loud, clattering chaos of the unloading camp seem to hush wherever he walked. His name, though no one asked it yet, was Ren. Ren had traveled with the caravan from his village at the foot of the southern hills, a quiet place known for its healers and its herb gardens rather than its warriors. Yet he had never seen a war camp before, had never stood this close to wolves large enough to look him eye to eye while standing on 4 legs, and yet he did not flinch when a pair of scouts loped past him, tongues out, eyes wild with the excitement of a full moon rising. He simply kept walking, following a sound that had caught his attention the moment the caravan crossed into camp, a low, aching whimper coming from a tent near the healer's fire, a sound so full of sorrow that it seemed to pull at something inside his chest. No one stopped him as he set down his basket and slipped through the tent flap. Perhaps it was because omegas were rarely seen as any kind of threat in a warrior camp. Perhaps it was because the sound he made drawing back the flap was so gentle that even the 2 guards posted outside barely noticed him pass. Inside, he found the great gray wolf lying motionless in the straw, his ribs showing more than they should, his once proud coat dull and matted. Ren had grown up around animals, had spent years learning which herbs eased pain, and which teas calmed a racing heart, but he had never seen an animal look quite like this. Not sick in body, sick in spirit. He knelt down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movement, and began to hum. It was not a song with words. It was something his grandmother used to hum to him when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms, a low, wandering melody that rose and fell like water moving over stones. He did not know why he chose it now, only that something in the wolf's posture, the way his body curled in on itself as though bracing against a pain no medicine could touch, reminded Ren of every frightened creature he had ever tried to soothe. Fenrir's ear twitched. It was the smallest movement, but Ren noticed it immediately, and he kept humming, softer now, moving his hand slowly toward the wolf's massive head. He half expected to be snapped at, or at the very least growled away, but instead, after a long moment of stillness, Fenrir's eyes opened. They were the color of old amber, cloudy with pain, and something deeper, something that looked almost like grief, and they fixed on Ren's face with an intensity that made the young Omega's breath catch. "Hello," Ren whispered, keeping his hand steady, letting the wolf choose whether or not to accept the touch. "You've had a hard time, haven't you?" Fenrir did not growl. He did not pull away. He simply watched Ren with those tired amber eyes, and for the first time in 4 days, according to the healer who arrived a moment later, carrying a fresh bowl of water, and stopped dead in the tent's entrance, the great wolf's tail moved. Just slightly, just once, but it moved. Ilsa stood frozen in the doorway, water sloshing over the edge of her bowl, staring at the stranger kneeling beside a wolf that had refused every hand offered to him for days. "Who?" she managed. "Are you?" Ren looked up, startled, as though he had forgotten anyone else existed in the world beyond the wolf in front of him. "My name is Ren," he said softly. "I came with the caravan. I heard him crying, and I couldn't just walk past." Ilsa's eyes moved from the boy to the wolf and back again, taking in the way Fenrir's body had eased slightly, the tension in his shoulders loosening for the first time since the injury. She had tended this wolf for weeks. She had used every salve, every prayer, every trick 2 decades of healing had taught her, and nothing had moved him even a fraction of what this quiet stranger had accomplished in a matter of minutes. "Stay there," she said, setting down the bowl with trembling hands. "Do not move. I need to fetch the king." Kale was in the war tent when Ilsa burst through the entrance, out of breath, her face flushed with something between disbelief and desperate hope. He was on his feet before she finished her first sentence, moving through the camp faster than he had moved in days, his heart hammering with a fear he refused to name even to himself. He had prepared himself, he thought, for the worst news. He had not prepared himself for what he found instead. He stopped at the entrance to the healer's tent and simply stared. A boy he had never seen before, an Omega, small and soft-spoken by the look of him, sat cross-legged in the straw beside Fenrir's massive head. And Fenrir, the wolf who had not lifted his head in 4 days, who had refused water and food and every attempt at comfort, was resting his chin gently against the boy's knee, his amber eyes half closed, his breathing slow and even for the first time since the injury. Kale's throat tightened. "What?" he said, his voice rough. "Did you do?" Ren looked up, and for a moment, Kale saw the flicker of nervousness cross his face, the realization that he was a stranger, kneeling beside the war-wolf of an alpha king he had never met, in a camp full of warriors who did not know his name. But he did not scramble away. He did not lower his eyes in the way many Omegas were taught to when addressed by an alpha of Kale's standing. He simply held Kale's gaze, steady and calm. "I didn't do anything," Ren said honestly. "I just sat with him. I think he's been very alone with his pain." Kale crossed the tent slowly, his eyes never leaving the wolf, and knelt on Fenrir's other side. The great wolf's tail thumped once against the straw, weak but unmistakable, and something in Kale's chest, that had been clenched tight for 4 days, finally loosened just enough to let him breathe. He hasn't done that, Cale said quietly, in a very long time. Ren's hand rested gently on the wolf's shoulder, and Cale watched the way Fenrir leaned, just slightly, into the touch. There was something in the boy's presence that Cale could not name, a stillness that seemed to calm every creature and every storm around it, and for the first time since Thornridge, Cale allowed himself to feel something other than fear. He allowed himself to feel hope. "Will you stay?" Cale asked, and it was not the voice of a king giving a command, but something quieter, something closer to a plea. A little longer, just to see if this was not simply chance. Ren looked down at Fenrir, who had closed his eyes fully now, breathing deep and slow against his knee, more peaceful than he had been in weeks. "I'll stay," Ren said, "as long as he needs me." Outside the tent, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the coming storm across the camp. But inside, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was quiet, real quiet. The kind that comes not from silence, but from the easing of a pain too long carried alone. Cale did not know it yet, kneeling there in the straw beside his brother's wolf, and a stranger with river-stone eyes. But the storm that was truly coming would not be one carried on the wind. It would be one that cracked open every wall he had built around his grief, every wound he had refused to let heal, and it would begin, of all places, in the water. Word spread through the Ironclaw camp quickly, the way it always did among wolves who lived so closely together that little escaped notice. By the second morning, half the pack had heard that a stranger, an Omega no less, had done in a single evening what the pack's most trusted healer could not manage in weeks. Not everyone welcomed the news. "An Omega," muttered Bram, one of the senior warriors, as he sharpened his blade near the training grounds, kneeling beside the warwolf. "It isn't fitting. That beast belonged to the king's brother. He deserves the touch of a warrior, not some southern herb boy who's never seen a battlefield." His companion, a broad-shouldered wolf named Dietrich, grunted in agreement, though his eyes drifted toward the healer's tent with something closer to curiosity than disdain. Fitting or not, the wolf's tail moved for the first time in a month. "I'd let a stranger sing lullabies to him every night if it brought him back to himself." Bram said nothing more, but his frown remained as Ren crossed the camp that morning, carrying a fresh bundle of dried chamomile and mint toward the healer's tent, entirely unaware of the debate his presence had stirred. Inside the tent, Fenrir was awake when Ren arrived, his head lifted from the straw for the first time since his injury, watching the entrance with an alertness that made Ilsa's breath catch when she saw it. The wolf's eyes tracked Ren's movement across the tent, and his tail thumped softly against the ground in greeting. "Well?" Ilsa said, setting down her mortar and pestle. "I have never seen him greet anyone like that, not even the king." Ren smiled, a small, quiet thing that transformed his tired face into something warmer. "May I sit with him again?" "You may sit with him every day, if it keeps him breathing," Ilsa said honestly. "I have tried everything I know. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." Ren knelt in his usual spot beside the wolf's head, unpacking a small clay jar of salve he had prepared that morning, from herbs he'd carried from home. He worked slowly, humming the same low melody as before, and began gently massaging the salve into the muscles around Fenrir's injured leg, careful never to press too hard against the healing bone. Fenrir did not flinch. He watched Ren's face the entire time, his amber eyes soft and searching, as though trying to understand something about the strange, gentle creature who had appeared out of nowhere and eased a pain that had felt endless. It was during this quiet moment that Cale entered the tent, having come, as he had every morning since, to check on his companion before the day's duties pulled him away. He stopped just inside the entrance, watching the scene before him with an expression Ren had not yet learned to read, something caught between wonder and old worn grief. "You're here early," Cale said, and Ren looked up, startled from his focus. "I wanted to check on him before the caravan continues south," Ren said. "I asked the trademaster for a few extra days. I hope that is all right." "It is more than all right," Cale said, crossing to sit on the other side of Fenrir, close enough that his knee nearly touched Ren's. The wolf's tail thumped again, twice this time, clearly pleased to have both of them near. "He hasn't eaten in days. Would he eat, do you think, if you offered it?" Ren considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, turning it over before answering. May I try? Ilsa brought a small bowl of softened meat, and Ren held a piece out on his open palm, patient and unhurried, waiting without pressure or expectation. Fenrir sniffed at it for a long moment, his eyes flicking between the offering and Ren's calm face, and then, slowly, he took it. Kale made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, something caught between the two, and pressed the back of his hand briefly against his mouth before he could stop himself. He hasn't eaten, Kale said, his voice thick, in 4 days. He's ready, Ren said softly, offering another piece, which Fenrir took with a little more eagerness this time. He was never refusing food because his body didn't want it. He was refusing because something inside him had stopped believing there was any point in getting better. Kale's eyes lifted to meet Ren's, sharp with sudden understanding. You speak as though you know grief. Everyone knows grief, Ren said simply. Some of us have just learned to sit with it instead of running from it. The words settled over Kale like a weight he had not expected, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply watching the wolf eat slowly from Ren's open palm, watching the way Fenrir's body, so tense and closed for weeks, seemed to soften piece by piece under this stranger's quiet patience. Over the following days, a routine formed, one that Kale found himself looking forward to more than he wanted to admit. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would find Ren already in the healer's tent, tending to Fenrir's wound, offering food, humming softly, while the wolf rested his heavy head against the Omega's lap. Kale would join them, sometimes staying only a few minutes before duty called him away, sometimes lingering far longer than he intended, caught up in the quiet peace that seemed to fill the tent whenever Ren was near. Not all in the pack were pleased by the arrangement. Bram made his opinions known loudly enough that they reached Kale's ears within the week, grumbling that a king who spent his mornings kneeling in straw beside an Omega and a broken wolf was not tending properly to the border tensions with the Vale Legion, which had grown worse in recent weeks, with reports of scouts crossing farther into Ironclaw territory than ever before. Kale heard the complaints and set them aside without much thought, too consumed by the small, fragile miracle unfolding in the healer's tent to care much for the grumbling of warriors who had never watched a brother's wolf waste away to nothing. It was Ren, however, who first raised the idea that would change everything. He needs to move, Ren said one evening, nearly a week after his arrival, watching Fenrir attempt, for the first time, to shift his weight and drag himself a few inches across the straw, before collapsing back with a frustrated whine. His body remembers what it used to be able to do, and every time he tries and fails, it breaks something in him a little more. The bone is still healing, Ilsa said gently. He cannot bear weight on that leg for months yet, perhaps longer, given how badly it was crushed. I know, Ren said, his brow furrowed in thought. But there might be another way. My grandmother used to speak of animals who lost the use of a limb, and how water could hold their weight for them, while their muscles remembered strength. There is a river not far from camp, isn't there? If the current is gentle enough, and if we could support him properly, he might be able to move his body again without putting any weight on the injured leg at all. Kale, who had been standing quietly near the tent's entrance listening to the conversation, felt something stir in his chest that he had not expected. Hope, sharp and sudden, and beneath it, fear just as sharp, the fear of watching this fragile improvement shatter against the unpredictable danger of moving water. The river's current can be strong beyond the bend, Kale said slowly, especially this time of year, with the mountain snow still melting into it. Then we go to the calmer part, Ren said, turning to him with an earnestness that made it difficult for Kale to argue. Please. I think this could truly help him. I would never ask if I did not believe he could bear it. Kale studied the young Omega for a long moment, taking in the quiet certainty in his riverstone eyes, the gentle stubbornness that had already coaxed a dying wolf back from the edge of giving up entirely. He thought of Fenrir lying motionless for days, of the terrible silence in the tent before Ren arrived, of the small, precious sounds of a tail thumping against straw, and a wolf eating from an outstretched hand. All right, Kale said finally, the word heavier than it should have been for something so simple. We'll try the river, tomorrow, at first light, before the camp wakes. Ren's face broke into the first full smile Kale had seen from him, warm and bright enough that it seemed to chase away some of the shadows that had gathered in the tent over the past weeks. Thank you, he said. I promise I will be careful with him." "I know you will," Cale said, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. Something about this quiet stranger had already earned a trust Cale rarely gave so easily. A trust built not on words or oaths, but on the simple, undeniable evidence of a wolf's tail thumping softly against straw for the first time in weeks. That night, Cale found himself standing outside the healer's tent long after the camp had settled into sleep, listening to the low, steady sound of wrens humming, drifting out into the darkness, and for the first time since Thornridge, he allowed himself to imagine a future where Fenrir ran again beneath the open sky. He did not yet know how much that river would come to mean to him, or how many of his own buried wounds it would eventually pull to the surface alongside his wolf's. He knew only that tomorrow, for the first time in months, he felt something close to hope. The morning air was cool and gray when Cale carried Fenrir from the healer's tent, cradling the great wolf's body with a gentleness that surprised even the two guards who accompanied them at a respectful distance. Fenrir was heavy, easily the size of a grown deer, but Cale carried him as though he weighed nothing at all, his jaw set with quiet determination as he followed Ren down the narrow path that led toward the river. Ren walked ahead, carrying a bundle of soft cloth strips they would use to support Fenrir's body in the water, his steps quick and eager despite the early hour. He had barely slept, his mind turning over every detail of what they were about to attempt, worrying whether he had judged the wolf's readiness correctly, whether the cold water might do more harm than good, whether he was asking too much too soon. But when he glanced back and saw the hope written plainly across Cale's face, hope the Alpha King rarely allowed anyone to see, Ren knew there was no turning back now. The river came into view through a break in the trees, wide and calm at this bend, its surface catching the first pale light of morning in scattered silver ripples. The current here moved slowly, pooling in a natural basin formed by smooth gray stones, shallow enough near the bank that a person could stand with the water only reaching their waist. "This is the place," Ren said, setting down his bundle of cloth. "The water is calm here, and the bottom is sandy, not rocky. It should be safe enough." Cale knelt at the water's edge, still holding Fenrir close against his chest. The wolf had grown alert during the walk, his ears pricked forward, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar sense of moss and river water, but there was no fear in his amber eyes. Only a cautious curiosity that Cale had not seen from him in weeks. "Are you ready, old friend?" Cale murmured against the wolf's ear, and Fenrir's tail thumped once against his arm in answer. Ren waded into the shallows first, testing the depth and the temperature, his breath catching slightly at the coldness of the mountain-fed water, but pressing forward anyway. When he reached a spot where the water rose to his chest, he turned and nodded to Cale. "Bring him in slowly," Ren said. "Let him feel the water on his paws first, before we lower him all the way in." Cale waded in carefully, the cold biting at his skin through his clothes, and lowered Fenrir, bit by bit, until the wolf's front paws touched the surface of the water. Fenrir stiffened immediately, a low whine escaping his throat, his claws instinctively curling as though searching for solid ground that was not there. "Easy," Ren said softly, moving closer, placing one hand on the wolf's shoulder, while Cale continued to support most of his weight. "You're safe. We have you. Just feel it for a moment, that's all." For a long, tense moment, it seemed as though Fenrir might settle, his breathing slowing, his body relaxing incrementally against Cale's supporting arms. But the moment Cale lowered him further, letting more of his body sink into the water, something in the wolf broke. He panicked. It happened so fast that neither of them had time to prepare. Fenrir thrashed violently, his front paws churning at the water, his body twisting in a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to find solid ground beneath him. His injured leg struck against a submerged stone and he yelped, a sound of pure animal terror that echoed off the riverbank, and in his panic, he pulled free of Cale's grip entirely, sinking beneath the surface for one heart-stopping second, before Ren lunged forward and grabbed a fistful of his fur. "I have him! I have him!" Ren shouted, hauling with all his strength against the wolf's thrashing weight, water splashing into his own face as he fought to keep Fenrir's head above the surface. Cale was there in an instant, both of them pulling together, dragging the terrified wolf back toward the shallows, until his paws finally found the sandy bottom, and he could stand, trembling and soaked, his sides heaving with ragged breaths. They got him onto the bank, all three of them collapsing into the wet grass, Fenrir shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide with a fear that broke something in Kale's chest all over again. "I'm sorry," Ren said immediately, his voice shaking as he pressed both hands against the wolf's heaving sides, checking for any injury from the panic. "I'm so sorry. I should have gone slower. I should have known." "You did nothing wrong," Kale said, though his own voice was far from steady, his hands still trembling as he ran them over Fenrir's body, checking for any new wounds. "I should never have agreed to this. He nearly drowned." He couldn't finish the sentence. The image of Fenrir sinking beneath the surface, even for that single terrible second, had opened something raw and old inside him, a fear so sharp it stole the breath from his lungs. He had already lost his brother. He could not lose this too. He could not. Ren watched the Alpha King's composure crack entirely for the first time since they had met. Watched the mighty ruler of the Ironclaw pack press a shaking hand over his own mouth, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he stared down at his trembling wolf. It was not the reaction of a king assessing a failed experiment. It was the reaction of a brother watching a piece of his family nearly slip away. "He's alive," Ren said gently, reaching across Fenrir's shaking body to rest a hand briefly on Kale's forearm. "He's alive, and he's safe, and we are not going to try that again until he's ready. I promise you that." Kale looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the wolf's ragged breathing slowly steadying between them and the distant call of birds waking in the trees along the riverbank. "He trusted us," Kale said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "And we nearly let him drown." "He trusted you," Ren corrected softly, "and that trust isn't broken. Frightened animals forgive faster than we expect them to, especially when they know, deep down, that the fear came from love and not carelessness." They stayed by the riverbank for a long while after that, letting the sun climb higher and warm the damp grass beneath them, letting Fenrir rest between them, with his head against Ren's knee and his flank pressed against Kale's leg, as though needing to feel both of them close before his trembling would fully ease. When they finally carried him back to camp, neither of them spoke of trying the river again anytime soon. But that evening, as Ren sat beside the healer's fire cleaning the mud from his clothes, he found Kale standing quietly in the entrance of the tent, watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. "Thank you," Kale said simply, "for pulling him out, for not letting go." "I would never let go," Ren said, and something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, settled into Kale's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he did not yet understand, outward through every part of him that had been closed off since the day his brother died. That night, long after Ren had fallen asleep curled beside Fenrir's warm flank, exhausted from the day's fright, Kale sat outside the tent beneath the stars, thinking not of the Veil Legion's advancing scouts, not of the border tensions that demanded his attention, but of the fierce determination in a quiet Omega's eyes as he fought the current with everything he had, to save a wolf that was not even his own. He did not yet understand what was beginning to take root in his chest. He only knew that something about Ren's presence made the crushing weight of grief he had carried alone for 2 years feel, for the first time, just slightly lighter to bear. For 3 days after the failed attempt at the river, Ren did not speak of water at all. Instead, he simply sat with Fenrir, hour after hour, in the quiet corner of the healer's tent that had become, without anyone quite deciding it, the wolf's own small territory within the camp. He brought fresh bundles of dried reeds each morning, letting Fenrir smell them, letting the scent of the riverbank become familiar and unthreatening, rather than something tied only to fear and cold water and the memory of sinking beneath the surface. "You're not rushing him," Ilsa observed one afternoon, watching Ren braid rivergrass into a loose cord, while Fenrir dozed with his head resting against the young Omega's thigh. "Most healers I know would push harder, worried the window for recovery might close." "Pushing harder is how we nearly lost him in the water," Ren said, not looking up from his work. "Fear doesn't heal on a schedule. It heals when it's ready, and forcing it only teaches the body to distrust every gentle hand that comes after." Ilsa said nothing more, but she watched with growing respect as the young Omega's patience unfolded day after day, never faltering, never showing the frustration that would have been so easy to feel after such a frightening setback. Kale found himself drawn to the tent more and more during those quiet days, arriving sometimes with reports still clutched in his hand, meant to be read elsewhere, forgotten the moment he stepped inside, and saw Ren's calm, steady presence beside his wolf. He began sitting beside them without announcement, without ceremony, simply lowering himself into the straw and letting the tension of border disputes and restless warriors ease from his shoulders in the quiet. "You don't have to sit with us every time," Ren said one evening, not unkindly, glancing up at Kale with something like curiosity in his river-stone eyes. "I know a king's time is valuable. There's nowhere else I'd rather be," Kale admitted, the words slipping out before he had fully considered them, and he watched a soft flush rise in Ren's cheeks before the Omega ducked his head back toward his work, hiding a small smile. It became, without either of them naming it, a kind of ritual. Each evening, after the day's duties had drained them both in different ways, they would sit together beside Fenrir, sometimes talking quietly about small things, the herbs Ren's grandmother had taught him to use, the training exercises Kale remembered from his own childhood beside his brother, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence, while the wolf slept peacefully between them. On the fourth day, Ren finally spoke again of the river, though this time his approach was different. "I don't want to carry him into the water again," he said, watching Fenrir chew contentedly on a strip of dried meat. "Not yet. I think we need to bring the water to him first, in a way that doesn't frighten him." Kale tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" "There's a shallow pool near the bend, barely deeper than a puddle, fed by the same river, but calm and still. I want to bring him there, just to sit beside it, to let him watch the water, without being asked to enter it. Let him choose, in his own time, when he's ready to put a single paw in." It was a slower path than either of them had originally imagined, but Kale found himself nodding without hesitation. He had learned in these past days to trust the quiet wisdom in Ren's patience, even when it moved far more slowly than his own instincts wanted. The following morning, they carried Fenrir to the shallow pool, exactly as Ren described, setting him down on a soft bed of moss, just beside the water's edge, close enough to see his reflection rippling on the surface, but far enough that no part of him touched the water itself. At first, Fenrir simply stared at the pool with wary suspicion, his body tense, his ears pinned slightly back, but Ren settled beside him without pressure, humming his familiar wordless melody, and slowly, over the course of the morning, the wolf's tension began to ease. By midday, Fenrir had lowered his head to rest on his paws, watching the water with something closer to interest than fear. By the second day at the pool, he had extended his nose far enough to sniff at the surface, sending small ripples outward that seemed to fascinate him more than frighten him. And on the third day, without any coaxing from either Ren or Kale, Fenrir dipped one front paw into the shallow water on his own, testing it, pulling back, then trying again. Kale, watching from where he sat cross-legged in the moss, felt his throat tighten with an emotion too large to name. "He's doing it himself," he murmured, disbelief coloring his voice. "He's choosing this. That's the only way it will ever mean anything to him," Ren said softly, his eyes shining with quiet pride, as Fenrir dipped his paw again, more confidently this time, small splashes catching the afternoon light. Healing forced on someone rarely lasts. Healing chosen, even one small paw at a time, changes something deep inside. Kale turned to look at Ren then, really look at him, taking in the soft lines of his face, the quiet strength hidden beneath his gentle manner, the unshakable patience that had, in a matter of days, begun pulling both his wolf and something buried deep inside Kale himself, back from the edge of a grief that had felt permanent. "You speak as though you're not only talking about him," Kale said quietly. Ren met his gaze, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his expression, quickly smoothed over, but not quite hidden in time. "Maybe I'm not," he admitted. "Grief doesn't care whether it wears fur or walks on two legs. It works the same way in all of us." Kale wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what shadows moved behind Ren's calm riverstone eyes, but before he could find the words, Fenrir let out an excited bark, the first bark either of them had heard from him since Thornridge, and both men turned to see the great wolf standing at the pool's edge, both front paws now submerged, his tail wagging in wide, joyful sweeps for the first time in months. The sound of Kale's laughter, sudden and unguarded, rang out across the quiet clearing, startling a flock of birds from the trees overhead. Ren looked at him, delighted by the unexpected joy breaking across the Alpha King's usually composed features. and found himself laughing too, the two of them sitting in the moss beside a healing wolf, as the golden afternoon light spilled down through the leaves. It was, Cale would think much later, the first time he had truly laughed since his brother's death, and it had happened here, beside this shallow pool, because of a quiet Omega who had walked into his camp with nothing but a basket of dried herbs, and had somehow, without ever meaning to, begun mending far more than a wolf's broken leg. That night, as they walked back toward camp, with Fenrir moving slowly but steadily between them, his limp still pronounced but his spirit visibly lighter, Cale found himself walking closer to Ren than strictly necessary, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the narrow forest path. Neither of them commented on it. Neither of them pulled away. Some walls, Cale was beginning to understand, did not fall all at once. They eased, brick by careful brick, the same way a frightened wolf learned to trust the water again. One small step, one paw dipped cautiously into the shallows, one evening walk home in comfortable, unspoken closeness beneath a sky full of stars. 2 weeks passed, and the shallow pool became Fenrir's favorite place in all the camp. Each morning, before the sun had fully cleared the treetops, he would wait by the entrance of the healer's tent, tail wagging, ears pricked forward with an eagerness that still brought quiet tears to Cale's eyes when he watched it, waiting for Ren to arrive so they could make their now familiar walk to the water together. The wolf's confidence grew steadily. He no longer simply dipped a paw in the shallows and retreated. He waded in fully now, up to his chest, splashing and playing in the calm water, while Ren stood nearby, ready to help but rarely needed to, laughing at the wolf's clumsy, joyful movements. But the shallow pool, calm and safe as it was, could only do so much. Fenrir's injured leg remained weak, the muscles atrophied from months of disuse, and while the wolf's spirit had returned in full, his body still lagged behind, unable to bear the weight it once had, unable to run, to hunt, to be the fierce war companion he had once been. "He needs the deeper water eventually," Ren admitted one evening, sitting beside Cale on a fallen log near the pool, while Fenrir paddled contentedly nearby. "The real river, the current, gentle as it is at the bend, is what will build the strength back into that leg. The pool has done wonders for his fear, but his body needs more than this." Cale watched his wolf swim in slow, careful circles, and felt the old fear stir again, the memory of that terrible morning, when Fenrir had nearly slipped beneath the surface, still sharp enough to make his chest tighten. "I don't know if I can watch that happen again," he admitted quietly, watching him panic, watching him sink. "I don't want to force it either," Ren said, turning to look at him fully. "But I think, if we go slowly enough, if we let him choose the pace this time, instead of lowering him in ourselves, it might be different. He trusts us now. He trusts the water in its smaller forms. I think he's ready to be shown the bigger water is not so different from the small." Cale was quiet for a long moment, watching Ren's face in the fading evening light, taking in the earnest hope written across his features, the same hope that had first pulled Cale toward this quiet Omega weeks ago, when nothing else in the world had seemed capable of reaching his grieving wolf. "All right," Cale said finally. "But this time, we let him lead. Every step of it. If he wants to turn back, we let him." "Every step," Ren agreed, and something passed between them in that moment, an understanding built not on words, but on the shared weight of hope and fear they had both been carrying together since that first frightening morning at the river. 3 days later, they returned to the calm bend where Fenrir had first panicked, though this time there was no rush, no lowering him bodily into the current. Instead, Ren simply walked into the shallows himself and called softly to the wolf, the same wordless melody he had hummed since their very first meeting, and waited. Fenrir stood at the water's edge for a long time, his body tense, clearly remembering the fear of that first attempt. Cale knelt beside him, one hand resting gently on the wolf's shoulder, not pushing, simply present, a steady anchor of comfort, while Fenrir worked through whatever memory played behind his amber eyes. "You don't have to," Cale murmured, "not today, not ever, if it's too much." But Fenrir's eyes were fixed on Ren, standing calm and patient in the gentle current, and slowly, one careful step at a time, the great wolf waded into the shallows on his own. Cale's breath caught as Fenrir moved deeper, the water rising past his chest, his good legs paddling steadily, while he favored the injured one, holding it slightly higher against the current's gentle pull. There was no panic this time, no thrashing, just the slow, determined movement of a wolf choosing, with his own free will, to trust the water that had once nearly taken him under. "That's it," Ren called softly, moving backward slowly, to draw Fenrir further into the pool, without ever grabbing or forcing him. "You're doing it. You're doing it all by yourself." Fenrir's tail began to move beneath the surface, sending small ripples outward, and then, astonishingly, he began to swim, his powerful body cutting through the calm water with a grace that had been buried beneath months of pain and fear, resurfacing now piece by piece with every stroke. Kale rose to his feet at the water's edge, his hands pressed against his mouth, watching his brother's wolf swim for the first time since Thornridge, watching the joy break across the great creature's face as he realized, perhaps for the first time since the injury, that he was not broken beyond repair. "He's swimming," Kale said, his voice cracking. "Ren, he's swimming." Ren laughed, bright and delighted, reaching out to steady Fenrir as the wolf paddled a wide, uneven circle around him, clumsy, but unmistakably joyful, water splashing in every direction. He remembered, Ren called back. His body remembered how, even after everything. Kale waded into the water without a second thought, not caring that his clothes soaked through instantly in the cold current, moving toward his wolf, and the quiet Omega, who had brought him back from a darkness that had felt impossible to escape. When he reached them, Fenrir turned and pressed his wet muzzle against Kale's chest, nearly knocking him backward with the force of his affection, and Kale wrapped both arms around the great wolf's neck, laughing and crying all at once, the sound echoing off the riverbank in a way that felt, for the first time in years, entirely unashamed. Ren watched them for a moment, something warm and full blooming in his chest, at the sight of the fierce Alpha King, embracing his wolf in the middle of the river, no crown, no armor, nothing but raw and unguarded joy. And then Kale's hand reached out, catching Ren's wrist gently, pulling him closer, until the three of them stood together in the shallow current, wolf and king, and the quiet stranger, who had changed everything. "Thank you," Kale said, his voice raw, looking directly into Ren's eyes, with an intensity that made the young Omega's heart stutter in his chest. "I don't have the words for what you've given him, what you've given both of us." "You don't need words," Ren said softly, water dripping from his hair, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and something else entirely. "I can see it. I can see it in the way he's looking at you right now." They stood there together for a long while, the setting sun casting the river in gold. Fenrir swimming small joyful circles around them both, and neither Kale nor Ren moved to step apart, content for the first time in longer than either could remember to simply exist in this fragile, hard-won moment of peace. That night, the camp celebrated in its own quiet way, word of Fenrir's swim spreading from tent to tent, until even the warriors who had grumbled loudest about the Omega's presence found themselves smiling at the news. Bram himself, gruff as ever, appeared at the edge of the healer's tent that evening, with a haunch of fresh venison, muttering something about the wolf needing to build his strength back properly, before retreating quickly, without waiting for thanks. Ren laughed softly when Ilsa told him about it later. "It seems I'm being accepted, one wary warrior at a time." "You've earned it," Ilsa said, settling onto her stool beside the fire. "Not many could have done what you did. I've healed wolves for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like the bond you've built with him." Ren said nothing to that, though his gaze drifted toward the tent's entrance, where he could hear Kale's low voice speaking to one of the border scouts just outside, discussing patrol routes and the increasing frequency of Vale Legion movements along the northern ridge. The war had not paused for Fenrir's recovery, and Ren was beginning to understand just how much weight rested on Kale's shoulders every single day, weight the Alpha King carried without complaint, without ever once letting it show in the gentle way he knelt beside his wolf each morning. Later that night, after Fenrir had settled into a deep, contented sleep beside the fire, exhausted from his swim, Kale found Ren sitting alone outside the tent, looking up at the wide spread of stars above the camp. "May I sit with you?" Kale asked, and Ren shifted over without hesitation, making room on the log beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the settling camp fading into the background, until Kale finally spoke, his voice quieter and more uncertain than Ren had ever heard it. "Fenrir wasn't always mine," Kale said, staring at the dying embers of a nearby fire pit rather than at Ren. "He belonged to my brother first, Corin. They grew up together, from pups and boys, inseparable in every way two beings could be. When Corin died defending our eastern border, Fenrir carried his body home across 3 days of hard country, refusing to rest, refusing to eat, and when it was over, he chose to bond with me instead of returning to the wild. I've always believed he did it because he understood, somehow, that I couldn't survive losing them both at once." Ren listened without interrupting, sensing that Kale needed to say this in his own time, in his own way, and Kale continued, his voice growing rougher with every word. "When he was injured at Thornridge, saving me from the same kind of death that took Corin, I thought I understood what was happening. I thought his body was simply healing slowly, but watching him give up, watching him stop eating, stop trying, I realized what I was really watching was grief. His grief and mine, tangled together in one broken body, because losing him would have meant losing the very last piece of my brother I had left in this world." His voice broke on the final words, and Ren reached over without thinking, taking Kale's hand in both of his, holding it firmly, grounding him the way he had grounded Fenrir countless times over the past weeks. "You haven't lost him," Ren said softly. "Either of them, not really. Corin lives on in the way Fenrir chose you, in the way you love him so fiercely. And Fenrir is still here, healing, swimming, choosing life again every single day. Grief doesn't erase what came before it. It just asks us to carry it differently." Kale turned to look at him then, and in the moonlight, Ren could see the raw vulnerability written across the Alpha King's face, stripped bare of every crown and title and warrior's mask he wore during the daylight hours. "How do you understand grief so completely?" Kale asked. "You speak of it as though you've carried your own for a very long time." Ren was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small, absent circles against the back of Kale's hand. "My mother died when I was young," he said finally. "Sickness took her slowly, over the course of a whole winter, and I watched her fade the way Fenrir was fading, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left of who she used to be. I couldn't save her. No herb, no salve, no amount of patience could stop what was happening. I think that's part of why I couldn't walk past your wolf that first night. I recognized something in him, something I hadn't been able to save the first time I saw it." Kale's grip tightened gently around Ren's hand. "I'm sorry," he said, "for your loss, and for whatever guilt you've carried because of it." "It wasn't my fault," Ren said, though something in his voice suggested he had needed a long time to believe those words himself. "But knowing that in my mind, and feeling it in my heart, were two very different things, for a very long time." They sat together beneath the stars, hands still joined, the weight of both their griefs settling into something softer between them, something that felt less like sorrow shared, and more like sorrow finally, truly witnessed. Kale found himself studying the profile of Ren's face in the moonlight, the gentle curve of his jaw, the quiet strength in his steady breathing, and felt something shift deep within his chest, something he had not allowed himself to feel since long before Corin's death. "Ren," Kale said softly, and the Omega turned to look at him, river-stone eyes catching the moonlight. "I don't know how to thank you properly for what you've done. Not just for Fenrir, for me." "You don't have to thank me," Ren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Being here, watching him heal, watching you learn to breathe a little easier, that has been its own kind of gift to me too." Neither of them moved to pull away, their joined hands resting warm between them, and for a long while, they simply sat together in the quiet dark. Two people who had each carried their grief alone, for far too long, finally learning what it felt like to set some of that weight down beside someone who understood. The following weeks brought a rhythm to camp life that felt, to Kale, closer to peace than anything he had known since before Corin's death. Every morning began at the river, where Fenrir's swimming grew stronger and more confident by the day, his injured leg slowly regaining the muscle it had lost, his strokes becoming smoother, more powerful, until even Ilsa admitted she had never expected such a full recovery from a wound so severe. But peace, Kale had learned long ago, rarely lasted without challenge. The reports from the northern border grew more troubling with each passing week. Vale Legion scouts had been spotted crossing farther into Ironclaw territory than ever before, their movements deliberate, purposeful, unlike the careless border testing of previous seasons. Cale's advisors grew restless, pressing him for decisions about troop movements, about whether to send envoys or prepare for open conflict, and the quiet mornings by the river became harder and harder to protect against the mounting pressures of leadership. "You look tired," Wren observed one morning, watching Cale rub at his temples while Fenrir paddled contentedly nearby, no longer needing either of them close at hand, strong enough now to swim independent laps across the widened pool they had cleared together over the past weeks. "The border situation grows worse," Cale admitted, sitting heavily on the familiar log by the water's edge. "Bram believes the Vale Legion is preparing for something larger than mere scouting. I fear he may be right." Wren settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, a comfort that had become as natural between them as breathing over the past weeks. "Do you have to leave camp?" "Not yet," Cale said. "But soon, likely. I'll need to ride to the Northern Watch myself, assess the situation directly, rather than relying on second-hand reports." Something flickered across Wren's face, quickly hidden, but not quite fast enough for Cale to miss it entirely. "You're worried," Cale said gently, "about something more than the border." Wren was quiet for a long moment, watching Fenrir swim easy circles in the water, before finally speaking. "The caravan I traveled with will be moving on soon too. South, back toward the villages, before the mountain passes close for winter. I've stayed far longer than the trademaster expected already." The words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the comfortable peace they had built together. Cale felt something tighten sharply in his chest, a fear entirely separate from the growing threat of the Vale Legion, and he turned to look at Wren fully, searching his face for answers to a question he had not yet found the courage to ask. "Must you go with them?" Cale asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Wren's eyes met his, wide with surprise at the raw honesty in Cale's question. "I don't know," he admitted. "My work here isn't finished. Fenrir still needs time to fully regain his strength, and I promised him I would see this through. And when his recovery is complete?" Cale pressed gently. "What then?" The question hung heavy in the morning air between them, and Wren's gaze dropped to where their hands rested close together on the log, not quite touching, but close enough that the space between them felt charged with something neither had yet named aloud. "I don't know," Wren said again, softer this time. "I hadn't let myself think that far ahead." "Would you consider staying?" Cale asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, raw and unguarded in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. "Not just for Fenrir's sake, though he adores you, that much is plain to anyone with eyes, but for mine as well." Wren's breath caught audibly, and he lifted his eyes to meet Cale's, searching his face for the truth behind the words. "Cale," he said carefully, "you're an Alpha King. I'm an Omega healer, from a small southern village. Our worlds are very different." "Our worlds," Cale said, reaching out to gently take Wren's hand, "have already woven together more tightly than I ever expected possible. You've healed my wolf. You've healed parts of me I didn't even realize were still bleeding. I don't know what the shape of this feeling is meant to be called, whether it fits neatly into the roles we were born into, but I know I don't want you to leave with that caravan, Wren. I know that much with absolute certainty." For a long moment, Wren said nothing, his thumb tracing an absent pattern across the back of Cale's hand, his eyes bright with an emotion too complex to name simply. Then, slowly, a small smile broke across his face, warm and genuine. "I would need to send word to my village," Wren said. "Let them know I've chosen to stay a while longer." "A while longer," Cale repeated, hope blooming warm and unfamiliar in his chest. "Or perhaps longer than that, if you found reason enough to want it." "Perhaps," Wren agreed softly, and the word carried a weight of promise that settled comfortably between them, unspoken but understood, as Fenrir swam a final joyful lap and clambered up onto the bank beside them, shaking water in every direction, entirely unaware of the quiet, tender shift that had just occurred beside the river that had already changed so much. That evening, Wren sent word with a departing trader that he would remain at Ironclaw camp through the winter, tending to the wolf's continued recovery, and, though he did not write this part down for anyone else to read, tending to something else that had begun to grow steadily inside his own chest, since the night he first heard a broken wolf's cry drifting through the darkness and could not bring himself to walk past. The peace did not last long. 10 days after Ren's decision to stay, a scout burst into camp at midday, his wolf lathered and exhausted from a hard ride, carrying news that spread through Ironclaw territory like wildfire. The Vale Legion had moved. Not scouts this time, but a full column of warriors, crossing the northern border under the cover of pre-dawn fog, striking a small outpost village before the Ironclaw watch could raise the alarm. Cale was in full armor within the hour, his advisors gathered around the war table, voices sharp with urgency as they mapped out response routes and troop positions. Ren stood at the edge of the tent, watching the transformation come over the man he had grown so close to these past weeks, watching the gentle, unguarded companion from the riverbank harden once more into the fierce alpha king his pack needed him to be. "I have to ride out," Cale said, finding Ren alone by the healer's tent that evening, his armor still gleaming with the polish his attendants had rushed to apply. "Tonight, with the strongest of my warriors. The outpost needs reinforcement before the Legion pushes further into our lands." Ren's chest tightened with a fear he had not expected to feel so sharply, a fear that reminded him uncomfortably of watching his mother fade, of watching Fenrir lie motionless in the straw those first terrible days. "How long?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "I don't know," Cale admitted. "Days, perhaps longer, depending on how deeply the Legion has entrenched itself." Fenrir, sensing the tension in the air, pressed himself against Cale's legs, whining softly, and Cale knelt to bury his face briefly in the wolf's thick fur, drawing strength from the very creature whose recovery had taught him so much about patience and hope over these past weeks. "He's strong enough to travel," Cale said, straightening. "I want him with me. His strength, his instincts, they've always been sharper than any warrior I command." Something in Ren's chest clenched painfully at the thought, the fear of losing both of them at once to a war that had already taken so much from Cale. But he understood, even through his fear, that Fenrir was not merely a healed wolf now. He was a war companion again, bonded to his king, and asking him to stay behind would be asking him to abandon the very purpose that had once given his life its deepest meaning. "Then let me check him one final time before you go," Ren said, his voice thick with emotion he fought to keep steady. "Make certain that leg is ready for whatever you'll ask of it." He knelt beside Fenrir in the fading evening light, running careful hands along the once shattered leg, feeling the strong muscle that had rebuilt itself over weeks of patient work in the river, checking the joint for any lingering weakness. The wolf stood steady and strong beneath his touch, nothing like the broken creature who had lain motionless in the straw all those weeks ago. "He's ready," Ren said finally, though the words cost him more than he expected. "Physically, he's ready for anything you ask of him." Cale reached out and gently tilted Ren's chin up, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "And you?" he asked softly. "Are you ready to let us go?" Ren's composure nearly broke at the question, tears gathering unbidden at the corners of his eyes. "No," he admitted honestly, "but I understand why you must. I understand what it means to be needed, and I would never ask you to abandon your people, not even for my own fear." "I will come back to you," Cale said, his voice fierce with a promise he intended to keep with every fiber of his being. "Both of us will come back. I did not survive Thornridge, and Fenrir did not learn to swim again, only to lose everything now." He pressed his forehead gently against Ren's, a rare moment of tenderness, stolen from the chaos of preparation swirling through the camp around them, and Ren closed his eyes, memorizing the warmth of the contact, the steady sound of Cale's breathing, the soft huff of Fenrir's breath against his knee. "Come back to me," Ren whispered. "Both of you. That's all I ask." "I promise," Cale said, and then, before either of them could second-guess the impulse, he closed the small remaining distance between them and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against Ren's lips, gentle, and full of everything neither of them had yet found the words to say aloud. When he pulled back, Ren's eyes were wet with tears that had finally spilled over, but his smile was genuine, full of a hope that steadied something deep in Cale's chest, even as the weight of the coming battle pressed heavy against his shoulders. "Ride safely," Ren said. "I'll be here, waiting." Cale nodded once, unable to trust his voice any further, and turned to mount his warhorse. Fenrir, falling into step beside him, with the same fierce, loyal readiness he had shown before his injury, fully healed now, in both body and spirit. Ren watched them ride out through the camp gates into the gathering dusk, the great gray wolf running strong and sure beside his king, and pressed a trembling hand against his own chest, praying to every quiet god his village had ever honored, that the river's gift would carry them both safely home again. The days that followed were the longest Ren had ever known. He kept himself busy in the healer's tent, preparing bandages and salves for whatever wounded might return from the northern conflict, but every spare moment found his eyes drifting toward the camp gates, watching, waiting, hoping for any sign of returning riders. Ilsa, sensing his anxiety, kept him occupied with tasks that demanded careful focus, grinding herbs, boiling water, sorting cloth by size and use, anything to keep his trembling hands steady and his mind from spiraling too far into worry. On the fourth day, a rider returned bearing news that spread relief through the camp, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The Ironclaw warriors had reached the outpost in time, driving back the Veil Legion's advance and reclaiming the territory before further harm could be done. Casualties had been light. The king himself was unharmed. They would return within 2 more days, once the wounded had been stabilized and the outpost secured against further attack. Ren wept openly at the news, unashamed of the tears streaming down his face, as Ilsa wrapped him in a warm embrace, murmuring quiet reassurances against his hair. When the returning column finally crested the ridge above camp on the 6th day, Ren was already waiting at the gates, having spent the entire morning unable to focus on anything but the horizon. He spotted Kale first, riding at the head of the column, armor dented and travel-worn but very much alive, and beside him, running strong and proud, Fenrir, his coat catching the afternoon sun, his previously injured leg carrying him with the same fierce confidence it had before Thornridge had nearly taken it from him entirely. Ren did not wait for propriety or ceremony. He ran through the gates the moment Kale dismounted, throwing himself into the Alpha King's arms with a force that nearly knocked them both off balance, and Kale caught him easily, holding him tight against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of herbs and river water that clung to Ren's hair. "You came back," Ren said, his voice muffled against Kale's shoulder, tears soaking into the travel-worn fabric of his cloak. "You both came back." "I told you I would," Kale murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of Ren's head, uncaring of the warriors and healers watching the reunion with open, delighted curiosity. "I made you a promise, and I intend to keep every promise I make to you from this day forward." Fenrir pushed his way between them, whining eagerly for attention, and Ren laughed through his tears, dropping to his knees to wrap both arms around the great wolf's neck, checking with careful hands for any injury, even as Fenrir's tail wagged wildly, clearly thrilled to be reunited with the Omega who had given him back his life. "You fought well, old friend," Ren murmured against Fenrir's fur, and the wolf huffed happily in response, nuzzling against his neck with obvious affection. That evening, after the wounded had been settled and the celebrations of the pack's safe return had quieted into the gentle hum of a camp finally allowing itself to rest, Kale found Ren by the riverbank, sitting exactly where they had first watched Fenrir swim, the moonlight silvering the calm water before them. "I've been thinking," Kale said, settling beside him, "about what happens now. Between us, the Veil Legion has been driven back, but I suspect this peace won't last forever. There will be more battles, more danger, and I understand if that frightens you enough to reconsider staying." Ren turned to look at him, his expression steady despite the fear he had carried through every long, sleepless night of Kale's absence. "I've already decided," he said. "The fear of losing you doesn't outweigh the joy of what we've built here. Not the fear of battles, not the weight of your crown, not the distance between an Alpha King and a village healer. I choose this. I choose you, and Fenrir, and whatever this camp becomes to me." Kale's breath caught, and he reached for Ren's hand, holding it tightly in his own. "Then I have something to ask you," he said, his voice carrying a nervousness that seemed entirely out of place on a man who had faced down enemy warriors without flinching just days before. "Stay with me, not merely as a guest, or even as Fenrir's healer, but as something far more permanent. Stay as my bonded mate, if you'll have me." Ren's eyes widened, tears gathering once more, though these carried none of the sorrow of the past week's worry, only overwhelming joy. "Kale," he breathed. Are you certain? I'm an Omega from a small village. I have no crown, no warrior's training, nothing to offer a king beyond. Beyond everything that matters, Kale interrupted gently. You gave my wolf back his life. You gave me back mine. There is nothing in this world I want more than to build a future beside you, here at this river, in this camp, for as long as we both shall live. Ren's answer came not in words, but in the way he closed the distance between them, kissing Kale with a fierceness that carried every fear and every hope of the past weeks, folded into a single, unguarded moment, and Fenrir, curled nearby in the moonlight, let out a contented sigh, as though he too understood that something beautiful and permanent had just taken root beside the river that had already given him back his life once before. Spring came early to Ironclaw territory that year, melting the last of the mountain snow into the river weeks ahead of season, swelling the water with fresh, cold current that danced silver in the morning light. It was at this river, exactly 1 year after a broken, grieving wolf had first learned to swim again, that the entire pack gathered to witness the bonding ceremony between their alpha king and the quiet Omega healer who had, in the span of a single winter, become as beloved to the camp as any warrior born within its walls. Ren stood at the water's edge in a simple tunic the color of new leaves, his hands trembling not with fear, but with an overwhelming joy he had never expected to feel so completely. Ilsa stood beside him, having become something like family over the past year, her weathered hand resting proudly on his shoulder as the pack gathered along the riverbank in quiet, expectant celebration. Kale approached from the opposite bank, dressed not in armor but in simple ceremonial cloth, his crown set aside for the day in favor of something far more meaningful than any symbol of rule. Fenrir walked beside him, fully grown into his old strength and more, his coat gleaming silver gray in the sunlight, a woven crown of river reeds resting proudly around his powerful neck, prepared by Ren's own hands the night before. The pack elder who presided over the ceremony spoke the old words of bonding, words that spoke of two lives joining as one river joins the sea, and Kale and Ren stood facing each other in the shallow water, exactly where they had first watched a broken wolf learn to trust the current again. When the moment came for them to speak their own vows, Kale's voice, usually so steady and commanding before his pack, wavered with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "A year ago," he said, "I knelt in this very water, believing I had lost everything that mattered to me. My brother was gone. My wolf was dying. I carried a grief so heavy I did not believe I would ever set it down. And then you walked into my camp with nothing but a basket of herbs and a gentle heart, and you taught my wolf to swim again. You taught me, without ever meaning to, how to breathe again beneath the weight of my own sorrow. I promise you, Ren, that I will spend every day of the life we build together being as patient with your heart as you were with Fenrir's, as gentle with your fears as you were with mine, and as devoted to your happiness as you have been to healing every broken thing that crosses your path." Ren, tears streaming freely down his face, reached for Kale's hands in the cool river water. "A year ago," he said, "I heard a wolf crying in the darkness, and I couldn't walk past his pain. I didn't know then that following that sound would lead me to you, to a family I never expected to find, to a home built not on walls but on patience and trust and the slow, careful work of healing what the world had broken. I promise you, Kale, that I will stay beside you through every storm the future brings, that I will kneel with you in whatever waters life asks us to cross, and that I will love you and Fenrir both with everything my heart has to give, for as long as the river flows." As their hands joined fully beneath the water's surface, sealing the bond between them, a great howl rose from Fenrir's throat, joyful and triumphant, echoing off the surrounding hills, and the entire pack erupted into celebration, the sound of their combined voices rising into the clear spring sky, like a promise fulfilled. Kale pulled Ren close against his chest, and there, standing in the shallow water where a broken wolf had once learned to trust again, where a grieving king had once wept openly for the first time in years, where a quiet Omega had proven that gentleness could heal what strength alone never could, they kissed, unashamed and unguarded, before the entire pack that had come to love them both. Fenrir splashed happily around them, sending water spraying in every direction, and the pack's laughter mixed with the sound of the river's steady current, a river that had witnessed fear become trust, grief become hope, and two broken hearts become, at last, whole. Years later, when the pack's young pups asked why the river bend near camp was called the Healing Waters, the old warriors who remembered that first difficult winter would tell the story exactly as it happened. Of a gentle Omega who refused to walk past a wolf's pain. Of a fierce Alpha King who knelt in the river and wept, unashamed, before his entire pack. And of the quiet, patient love that had taught them both, one careful step at a time, how to swim again, after nearly drowning in grief, too heavy to carry alone. The river still ran clear and steady past Ironclaw Camp, carrying the same gentle current that had once held a broken wolf's weight when his own legs could not, and every spring, when the pups of the pack learned to swim for the first time, their parents would bring them to that same familiar bend, to the Healing Waters, and tell them softly that some of the deepest wounds only healed when someone patient enough, someone gentle enough, chose to kneel down beside the pain instead of walking away from it.